Hello. Hi, Mark.
Hello there.
Um, so I'm Ursula Robb, and this is Mark Lorimer, and we have worked together and known each other for more than 20 years, mostly, Belgium, through Rosas, Teresa de Keersmaker, and Zoo. Is that right? Anything else? And we've done lots of teaching together. We've danced together. We've also taught each other movement. You've been rehearsal director for me, so you've watched.
Yes.
So between us, we've had quite some experience of passing on material and have different ideas about it. And so we're just going to start by talking about teaching groups of dancers passing on material. So known material, I think we should start with. No?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, written choreography, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
We were going to start with where you start, right?
Where do you start?
It's always, yeah.
You go.
It's always a question about, something just went off. Hold on. Are you there?
Joy's Zoom, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
It's always a question about where you start, even in any given piece, because we don't know if it's related to previous work, if it's related to a body of work, if it's very rare that a piece happens all on its own anyway.
Yeah.
And I guess in many ways people are quite keen to get to the steps, and it's always quite nice to start with some context. And
something that I've found, and that's changed for me as I've had more experience with teaching, is I also would have started with just focusing on the steps, like really going, okay, you've got to get that right. And it would only be afterwards standing back and going, okay, they've got it right, but what's missing, and having to learn vocabulary to understand how to discuss the other, what, where is the weight falling? How are you perceiving that? And then finding out, because so much of it is innate, it's in ourselves as we're teaching, that you don't know either as you're passing it on, what is their focus, what are they watching.
Yeah. There's also a kind of, I think even for people who are in a work, there's also a kind of funny amnesia or just forgetfulness that the piece often isn't made in a line either. That you look back on a piece as if we did this, and then we did this, and then we did this, but you forget the bit where then we went wandering off over here and we got really lost for a while, and then we understood that that's not what we're looking for. But that's also part of, that's not necessarily something to transmit to someone else, but it's part of how you know you arrived at what we arrived at often.
Yeah.
In those pieces that have a decent rehearsal time, there's a lot of research that we could say leads nowhere, but actually leads to an understanding of what we're not doing, and so everyone shares that information about
when you're making the piece together. Yeah.
Yes. So even if you talk about context to transmit, the very least I think you can do is explain what we did to arrive at what we did do, even if you could go further and say, and then we also went here, but we decided that wasn't right for this reason, and we went here. Those things are also part of arriving at a product somehow. So it's vast what you could include if you really wanted to explain a creation process.
True. I don't know how you've found it, but for example, when I've worked with the likes of a ballet company who are really professional, they're super efficient, they're much more interested in getting the steps learnt and then being told, okay, there's a tilt of head there and there's a pause there, rather than knowing that whole backstory. It's
yes.
And And I do feel like as accurate as you can get it, you do need some of that backstory in order to really understand what the tilt of the head means, or what is that imbued with. Sort of, and I struggle a bit with that, I think, of how to transmit that, and for someone to receive it, to want to receive it, because you have to be on the same page, I think, as well, and how authentic do you want it to be, or do you just want to mimic? That's
Yes, I mean, and that, of course, you're making reference, I guess, to the Paris Opera, when we both had different experiences of having to teach repertory pieces.
Yeah.
Which is also the thing, most of the time when you're passing on repertory, it's to people who seem to care deeply about what you're giving them, which is, which can be the case in a large company like that. And it can also be that, listen, I'm in your rehearsal today, and tomorrow I'm doing Balanchine, and the next day I'm doing this, and frankly, just teach me what I have to do.
Yeah.
And also it's very different, and I'm mixed about it. I totally agree with you that it's great if they show an interest to listen to your information about how we decided, or what it is you're trying to communicate simply. It doesn't even need to be contextual. It can just be, you need to invest this with a feeling of hesitation or leaving, or just to speak briefly, and you can edit it out later. There was this in the Nacht we were teaching in the last time I was teaching in the Paris Opera, and there's the moment in the duet that you did actually with Oliver. There's the moment where he starts. It's like a crescendo in the music, and it's a very strange choice. In this crescendo, there's a kind of stillness, and he walks away. He hesitates, and he comes back, hesitates next to her, and then the duet goes on, and it's all resolved, and everything is opening again. That became the most difficult thing to teach in the Paris Opera. That
stillness.
The walk away, hesitate, turn back, come back, stand next to her, and then we can go on. Because, but in the end, and I'm not sure if it was the right thing to do, in the end I had to reduce it to, maybe we could express hesitation by leaving the heel up at the back, and rather than putting the feet together and keeping the chest so high, maybe hesitation could be slightly more reflective and looking down, and maybe the turn could be more hesitant.
That's exactly what I mean. It's like the tilt of the head. It has to be absolutely choreographed rather than, and yes. That I feel like stillness, or those small subtle things, are the hardest, and not just to a company like that, but for someone who hasn't been through the making of it to really. Yeah. And yet it's strange because it's all about storytelling. Speaking in a ballet, it's the narrative. It's so specific. Yeah. So I have pondered on that quite a bit, and also in a different way for students when I'm teaching, because of their youth, and there's a kind of a fear, I think, of stillness. I think that's one of the hardest things to learn, is how to be really calm and still. And because the last year that I did a group piece with students, by the end they were racing ahead of the music, like they were almost a minute ahead, because what I'd really be able to get them to do in the studio of completely taking the time and breathing and taking those moments, the excitement, just, that performative sort of thing. But I also think that's, in general, knowing how to just, or trust that quiet and calm, and that it doesn't take anything more, but having to choreograph a shape.
But it also has something to do with the fact that, I don't know, I'm very happy to be extremely precise over something that I think it's not quite what you think it is. Actually, it needs to be a little bit more like this. I can be super precise in terms of body direction, but there's also a point where you want to say, I don't know how you would walk away, hesitate, reflect, come back, stand quietly next to somebody, and then go on. And there's a sort of desire that, even though it's repertory and you know that you should just be teaching this thing, you also want, how would you do that? Yeah. And because you know that the original person who did it, and maybe if it's in the company itself, in Rosas, who made the piece, you wouldn't need, you would want to see this person's version of walk away, hesitate, come back, stand.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of reluctance also, despite the fact that we're very happy to be extremely precise on certain things, there's a kind of reluctance to say, do this. Just stand like this and lower your chest and look there on the floor. Yeah. And because you think that can't be conveyed anything for them. So and I think it often comes down to, also in the kinds of work we've done, it comes down to the fact that I mean, with Rosas especially, but it's kind of, these are people who dance. This is a very kind of structured, orchestrated choreography, but there are still people inside it doing it. So there's a personal relationship to the material, and you can't, as well as everything else that you want to transmit, you also want to say, own it. Please own it. And I'm here to tell you if you go too far, or if it's not quite that, but try to take it. And so if it becomes too machinistic, I don't know, too much like a machine producing the result, there's also a sadness to that.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the thing, I think I want that ultimately when I am transmitting material, is I want that there is a moment where they really do feel the confidence and that they've understood enough about what I've been trying to share to own it. Because I think that's something myself, when I would learn from people, is I would be initially, years ago when I was, younger, would be that whole thing of really wanting to do it right. And so sometimes forgetting who I was in that, and trying to be the mimic and get it so right and so accurate that I would find myself, if I had to dance next to someone, always deferring, rather than really feeling like I could own it now, because...
Yes, especially if you admire the work that you're being transmitted, it's very hard, the idea that you could bring something to it. I'll just be happy if I can fill this out in some kind of way that's,
standing in someone else's shoes. It's a really hard thing.
Yes.
And so...
But dances are all different, and there's a lot of kind of...
Exactly.
Between complete disregard for the original and over
cautious. And that's the thing, I don't think there is a one hard and fast rule or way, because I've come across it all the time, like you can teach contemporary dancers a Rosa's piece and you feel like you can get really, really close to the original because we're all got the same sort of backgrounds, or the same, coming from a similar...
And a choice to be there somehow.
And then again, it's like, even amongst our own group of teachers, we notice that more and more we have to discuss deeply about what is it that we're trying to convey or transmit. Because if we just left, I mean, we see it when there's maybe 3 teachers teaching a group of part students, and each...
Where is the piece? Where do you think the piece is? What is the piece? Is it these steps? Is it this spirit? Is it this... and in a group,
when there's the showing, you can say, just by looking at the dancers, who taught what, because
and that's fascinating, because we also think that it's this thing, but it's not. It's a thing viewed from different perspectives.
Totally.
But I wanted to go back to a tiny thing that you touched on that I also think is quite important and almost political. It's about mimicry. And just the fact of calling it mimicry rather than I don't know, reproducing something. There is another word that I've lost, but that kind of learning something that someone else made is very unfashionable in dance education now.
Yes.
Imitation, that's the word I'm looking for.
Imitation.
And I must say that when I had either as a dance student or as in situations where we had to learn material from someone else, I always find that fascinating. The chance that you get to learn steps, but also a physical logic of someone else means that you get to understand the way they're thinking about movement, that they put this next to this and then they've folded it into this, means that you will learn that, you will own that, and it will become part of your skills somehow. But there's a maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that there's a kind of indignation at being asked for people in terms of making material, that they want to bring their own material and only their own material to creations now. Whereas I'm very happy if my material is used, but I'm also very happy to learn what someone else made and understand how you think like that, physically you think like that.
And I think there's huge value to that as well, just for especially as a student, for the development.
Yes, yeah.
Like you say.
Just let's learn a phrase. Why is learning a phrase suddenly so unpopular? I don't know, but maybe it's an old-fashioned thing, but I think it's a wrong idea about identifying as an artist. I think it's the idea that if I'm an artist, I make my own material. But if I'm an artist, I can also learn a lot about someone else's style. I can learn a lot about, or be challenged by another way of moving that isn't my own, or lots of different things. And the other thing I wanted to say just briefly about that was that despite our sort of resistance to the Paris opera style, they are extraordinarily good at taking that kind of minutiae direction if they're on board. And so in the end, stand with your heels slightly up, drop your chest, look there, take this number of seconds before you turn back at this speed, and then come back and stand next to her.
Exquisite and amazing. No, absolutely.
But that's a kind of sadness of so that, and in terms of what we're talking about, it's like, well, it's painstaking, but you can reproduce it in exchange of weight, but you can also exchange it in. What we were trying to do here was give the impression that this is a group who are really enjoying being together. I could also say it like, you have to look at her, and then you have to look at him, and then quickly you have to look at, but you could also just say, we're a group and we need to communicate that we're a group. So try to look at each other as much as possible. And I mean,
that, I guess that's it. That was such a eye opener for me when I worked with them, because I, was trying to do that general thing of saying, here we just kind of, if you pass that person, you smile, and realizing, but there's a hierarchy you're dealing with, etc. They don't function as a group in the same way. So you have to somehow build that knowledge in to the transferring the material and the whole story. So,
and to get permission to look at each other is complicated there.
Yeah. So those things it was quite crazy. Yeah. But can we just talk a little bit about weight as well?
Yes. Well, it's because one of the things I notice, even when I see Rosas reproduce a piece, or the first big dangers for me are, the two we can talk about. It's to do with weight, and that shape. For me, I see that shape takes precedence over weight. Yeah. That people can catch what the shapes are that the body is making, but they don't necessarily see how they're moving between things. And so, and it's true that weight is harder to see, but weight is also the thing that is like the thing that transmits to a public super well. I've always enjoyed watching dance material when it's really expressing, weight or weightlessness, whatever that is, that you feel a suspension, or you feel a I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
That form become, and this also can to do with time or whatever, but form takes precedence.
Yeah, and that's something I'm finding always, and especially with the students. Well, not just, actually with everyone. If you haven't had that sort of time working together, perhaps in a class, to understand how important that is. And one of the things, especially with Rosa's early works, when the use of breath was so prevalent, or certain pieces still perhaps, but when it was in silence and everything had to be unison, and use of breath was what led everything. So the weight could go together hand in hand with that in a way. And so, I feel like that's something I'm trying to always bring into the teaching and transmitting now, is how to use weight.
Yeah, which is also waking up the eyes of the person learning to not, because, like I said, form is much easier to catch.
Yeah, but it's true, it doesn't look anything like it. So I can be watching a group and say, no, the shapes, everything's right, but it's too quick often because there's no weight in it.
Yeah.
But, and that's one of the things that can make it really difficult, because that does go back to the whole dance education as well, no? Of how you've been trained.
Yeah. how awake are your eyes to seeing it, and then to experience it, and then to reproduce it, I guess.
Yeah. And there was something that you'd mentioned, we were speaking the other day, how you called it onomatopoeia.
Yes, because we were talking about ways of that. My dear friend Ursula is the queen of onomatopoeia in terms of dance, but because when I was rehearsal directing, I used to watch them do drumming quite often, and Ursula has a solo very near the front of the stage, actually. And for once, I was in the front row or the second row or something, and I could hear the whole concert of that accompanies and makes possible the movement, which is even the performer reminding themselves about the movement as they're doing it. But it can definitely be a super tool for.
Well, it's
again probably completely out of date and completely.
Oh
but
my God, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's embarrassing because I realise that, and it's just something that's I've wondered about it, because it's true. I use sound and a lot, and also when I'm teaching, I realise I say to people, you've got to find the song. You've got to have the song going on, because I think, and it is that word synesthesia. I've wondered about it, where it's this sort of combining the senses, like how some people will say Thursday is blue, or the colour. Number one is the colour red. They have this blending of senses, and I've wondered if perhaps I do that a lot because movement has a sound for me, a silent, like an internal sound, and I express that and I still do that. And I know that when I'm teaching people, they're often laugh, and I sort of have always thought everyone has that, but you did sort of bring that out to me, like, I think you can tone it down a bit, because
no,
I'm sure you?
I loved it. I just hadn't been that close before. I mean, they always just give you a random seat about where you have to sit, and I thought, wow, I never knew that it was actually coming out like that. But no, it's more the fact that I think if you edited that, it would also be missing from the movement.
Yeah.
So I guess it's also those things of, I think in terms of transmission, if you say on the movement, it's going to be clear. It's not a.
Yes.
I've got the movement. I've got the speed of the thing, but now I know it needs to have that feeling to it as well.
Yeah.
Whether the person themselves needs to make that noise, I don't know, but it definitely speaks beyond. Please be fast, please be sharp, please be whatever you might try to say about the thing. It's a shortcut. It just says exactly what it is. If it also goes ho, 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 then we also know what kind of movement we're looking for somehow.
So I use sound a lot when I'm teaching.
I'm a fan of onomatopoeia.
Right. And
also, and I guess in the synesthesia thing, any sense that, if a movement smells like something, then maybe go with that too.
Exactly. No, so I think that would be something that I would say I would use a lot as far as a tool, would be getting them to think in terms of sounds or songs, or sort of some sort of story that's abstract, but that gives you a reason to perhaps slow right down to then speed up again, or thinking of a dynamic and elasticity, because unless it's kind of like really supposed to just be like no dynamic, which is another thing.
But then a good would work really well with that too.
It's true. Just a drone. So would you have anything that you think is specifically a style of you that you use, in that
useful
way? When you're teaching?
I mean, when I'm teaching, I like undefendable adjectives. Or, yes, like, this movement should be really grubby.
Okay.
Or this movement should be really chewy, and we should fit, things that you couldn't honestly say, but everybody knows what that is. It's stringy. It's
yeah.
It's like ice or whatever, and it just
anything to.
I think even the word that doesn't, directly describe fast, slow, in the same, it's exactly the same as the sound. I think that
But you're very good.
Very often the imagination can make something concretely more precise about what you're looking for in a because you're appealing to people's imagination even with the onomatopoeia. You're
sure.
Like, what does mean? Like, what's that? But it says something about the urgency of the movement, or about the, which of course, then eventually gets all through to music and why we would respond to music like that. But I mean,
yeah,
Mickey Mouse kind of way, which of course we're not afraid of.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the things that one of the questions down here is, what do you think is going to happen now? Like, with all of this, how did your teaching go actually through Zoom? How have you found that?
It starts next week.
Doesn't happen.
So I don't know. Really well. Yeah.
Yeah, it went really well. Yeah. Yeah, and no, it's what's going to happen, I suppose, with when we can't meet. For me personally, it's not the way that I want. It's
no
tangible. I need that kind of.
Well, I mean, what I said to the organization for whom I will be teaching, I don't think it's interesting for me to teach a whole bunch of tondus. We can pass through those things, but I think if we're going to meet online, it's to be together, it's to see each other dancing, and that I don't know technically how well we can observe each other dance together, have different things to do, but also I think I guess a lot of people are losing the dancerly skills that are beyond being physically in shape, just dancing in whatever way, and what that is, apart from, I can do a really good yoga class or a Pilates class online, and that's great, really great. But the improvising together, or making a small phrase and learning a phrase and doing exactly these things of sort of mimicry, whether that be with a little kind of hand ballet or something on a different scale, could also be part of keeping those skills, like I know how weight's operating, I know what time is, and I know what texture is. I think those things are also, I will try to bring those things in next week when I'm teaching.
Wow, that's great. Good luck with that. Yeah, that's what so far I haven't had to teach in that way, so it's something I'm also really thinking about. How is that going to happen? How can I transmit like that?
I mean, at this point, people are just grateful that you'll do anything. Just to be in a group. But were it to go on for a long time, I mean, the idea of training a dancer at this kind of distance, or teaching a piece, would be extraordinary. But maybe the technology would catch up, and I don't know. Maybe we could have.
And is there anything else you want to speak about?
About more generally? Well, the only other thing we had talked about was that very often what happens, which is probably to do with the other thing that happens is every movement becomes important, which is not true of the people who necessarily made it, who understand that this is the phrase, and we've seen it 12 times before because it's a Rosa's piece, but then this time I want this thing to come out because of the relation to the music and the repetition or the whatever, and
but also
that's hard to communicate.
Yeah, that's true, because we teach all the steps, every step, and where it goes next is important. But of course, that's it. So it is really interesting when you see. But
and I taught you this really precisely, but now I would like you to throw that away so that we can see this more clearly. So just throw that away. You can do it, but don't do it too well. And I don't know. I'm not even sure that we would know that we'd made things in that way. But there's just a thing about. Again, there's a thing about hierarchy, about in this moment and in this moment and in this relation to the music. I think that these three movements really need to come out, and the rest of them you need to do, but you actually need to make them less important so that we see those 3 moments really well. And that's complicated for people who are really trying to do their best and do what you taught them, is to say, what, do that badly? Yeah.
It makes me think too, one of the things that I do find, it comes back a little bit, the value of learning repertoire or something else, is there's a sort of, I don't know if humble is the right word, but I think I see it a lot with some students who get very attached to their own sort of stylistic kind of way of moving quite early on, and there is having to let that go and actually learn something, very neutrally.
But it's not, I mean, I totally agree, but they're not being asked to let that go. They're being asked to, I'm just going to have to answer my front door a second.
Okay, shall I just pause? I'll keep talking. We're back again. Yes, Mark just had to have a...
Well, it was interesting because what I wanted to say was that they don't really have to let those things go. They just have to suspend them for a moment while they learn something else. And it's also, I mean, I'm just going to come back looking completely old school about this whole thing. It comes back to the same thing about imitation.
Yeah.
As imitation being a valuable thing somehow. And you're not going to disappear if you learn something else. You will still be there, you will be enriched, and you will have more physical options.
That's what I think is the misconception, is that they think they're losing something of themselves at times, and there's a fear to let go of their cloak or whatever, and actually it's just all empowering. But I agree with you.
If I had just been left to the way I moved without learning anything else, I would be...
Yes, we think about that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also fascinating that, I mean, just the last looping up of the thing about why would you give context, as well as because we've talked a lot about the imitation side of repertory or teaching or transmission. But there's also, like, you could learn about pieces in textbooks, but you could also learn about them in the studio while like this material does this thing, and we were asked these 3 questions, and that's how we came up with this material. So it didn't just arrive. It was based on these questions, or linking together these Rodin statue images, or this.
Yeah, do you know, it's interesting too, because that whole perception thing is interesting, because I know that, say, teaching some of Rosa's Dance Rosas, during this period we've used the Rosa Dance Rosas with some students, so they've had to watch the website, plus we went over some of the material with me beforehand, and I think it's very easy for young people, what do I sound like? Or for people to look at it and think it's about seduction, perhaps, or being sexy or whatever, when actually it can also just be seen as really powerful women being strong. And I noticed with some of my students, they responded so much better once I gave them permission and said, no, this is about women just being really strong. But they read it themselves, and it wasn't necessarily that it was performed like that, it's just what they thought of. And so it's discussing it and talking about it is so important, having the backstory as well. I realized that sort of took them into an entirely different place, and they could really defend what they were doing, or whereas they felt a little bit shy when they thought it was perhaps about being
and it's also the 80s. Yeah, it's also there's this artist, Antoine de Kismaker, but she's 23 years old, making this piece with 3 of her friends.
Yeah.
No, I mean, she's super ambitious and everything, but it's also like, what do you want to say about being a young woman in the 80s? Also, it's like you want it to be I mean, it clearly is it's a mountain to climb. I think to dance that piece is 2 hours non-stop, and at the same time. Yeah, they're seductive, but they're powerful and whatever.
powerful. It's not just like MTV now kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to contextualize it, if you want to go even further, is to look at, she's very interested in Pina Bausch. She's also very interested in Lucinda Childs. And I saw only recently the dance piece, it's called Dance, the piece by Lucinda Childs. And I was amazed at the parallels between the solo in Faza and Lucinda Childs. It's, not that it's plagiarism, but it's, you can also go further with those things, and it's interesting to see. In the same way that you can talk about, no, I won't go into that. C'est bon.
Yeah. Well, I think we've probably spoken for our allotted time as well, and thank you.
Always lovely to talk.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, we'll just finish up there. So, thanks a million, and bye.
Yes, and hopefully we'll meet in the studio sometime.
Yeah, I know exactly. Okay. Right.
Okay.
Mark. Bye.
Bye.